Good to see each one this evening. Friday evening is kind of hard to get people out and studying spiritual things. We have a good number here and we appreciate it. We're talking this evening about, we have the wrong slide, okay, about fossil man. And I want to begin with a statement by Roger Lewin, who is one of the leading authorities in the field of paleoanthropology, editor of Research News and Science magazine. And he's speaking about evidence for evolution, and particularly for fossil man. He says the key issue is the ability to correctly infer genetic relationship between two species on the basis of similarity in appearance. Now, we talked about that last evening, so that's something that we've covered. But that's the bottom line. How do you know this fossil led to that fossil? Well, it's kind of similar, and you eyeball it, and then there are more specific ways to compare. But the whole ball game, the key issue, is similarity, and we know that's deceptive, as he goes on to point out. It is deceptive, partly because similarity of structure does not necessarily imply identical genetic heritage. A shark, which is a fish, a porpoise, which is a mammal, look similar, and we pointed this out last evening. And so the foundation, the key issue, is deceptive and doesn't really prove their point, according to this leading authority. Richard Lewontin is a biologist from Harvard, very outspoken anti-creationist. But he was caught at a weak moment being interviewed in Harper's, and I think stated things very plainly. He says, we don't know anything about the ancestors of human species. I want to be fair, and in order to represent him correctly, we have to really emphasize the word no. And what he's saying is not that we don't know anything, but that as far as really knowing for sure, we don't know. All the fossils that we've dug up and are claimed to be ancestors, we haven't the faintest idea whether they're ancestors. No, he does have the faintest idea and teaches it very devoutly, but as far as knowing, he's somewhat overstating his conviction at this point. But he says it's up to you to draw the lines. And they certainly do, because there are no lines. And we tend to forget that sometimes. The lines do not exist. Excuse me. This is the picture that's in most of the textbooks. And we see that this is supposed to lead up to man through this series of fossil men. At the beginning, where did Australopithecus come from? Where does the bottom line come from? Notice the point made by Donald Johanson, who is the discoverer of Lucy, the most famous first link here, Australopithecus. At any rate, modern gorillas and orangs and chimpanzees spring out of nowhere, as it were. They're here today, they have no yesterday. And so this beginning point, there is none. You just start at where they say the beginning is. Another factor that we need to consider as we begin is to understand, in order to make sense out of a picture of fossils, you got to have all of the evidence, and that's seldom the case in the fossil record. When you only have part of the picture, you get misled. Now, many of you perhaps would recognize this picture. Thank you. Artist here, and this is a very famous picture. Everybody recognizes. I see somebody does, and if they do, they're pretty sharp. Yes, you know the picture, but you don't recognize it from this. This is the rest of the picture, and the little square you see over there on the side, most wouldn't recognize. They see that and they, okay, but they don't get the whole picture, do they? That's the way it is with the fossil record. We see a part of it, and it's very often not the whole thing. Very dramatically, we can illustrate that as we look at this lineup that is representative of what you see in the textbooks. One thing that's missing is a discovery they've announced just fairly recently, 2019, an extinct giant ape directly linked to living orangutans, Gigantopithecus, 3 meter tall, that's almost 10 feet, about 1,300 pounds, a very heavy primate, revealing the orangutan as its closest living relative. It was discovered in 1935, so yes, I knew about that discovery much earlier, but they finally announced it. But that changes the picture, doesn't it? When you put something like this in your lineup, then it doesn't look like it did before. You get the rest of the picture, and it distorts it. Let's also notice a statement by Ernest, one of the more famous anthropologists. He's biologist, senior editor of Nature. Nature is the most authoritative science journal in the world. And he makes the very obvious statement, no fossil is buried with its birth certificate. To take a line of fossils, which is what is typically done when you're talking about fossil men, claim that they represent a lineage is not a scientific hypothesis that can be tested, but an assertion carries the same validity as a bedtime story. Amusing, perhaps even instructive, but not scientific. Now, that's a pretty good introduction to the subject. It's not scientific to line up the fossils and say this is the way it was, especially when a lot of the evidence is not available. But let's look at the lineage as represented in the textbooks, beginning with Australopithecus. The most famous is Lucy. Donald Johanson is the discoverer, and that's in all of the earth science textbooks, and she's supposed to have walked upright because she had feet that looked a lot like ours, and the Latoy footprints that we'll look at later in the session were proof of that. Along with her, they found the footprints, and they were perfectly modern, or at least very modern. I think perfectly modern is a better description. But just recently, we found the rest of the picture that's not in the textbooks. We found one of about half a dozen now specimens that we have of this creature. And she had an ape foot, not a human foot. Here, this is reported in Nature, and articulated foot bones from the same area as Lucy shows she had a divergent big toe, like the hand has with the thumb, for prehensile grasping to reach around the branches with her foot. And so those footprints are not hers at all, which messes up the idea she stood upright, which messes up the idea she belongs in the lineage. And there are lots of other problems as well. The hips were wrong. She couldn't stand up with the hips as they were found, and so they came up with a solution for this, and we're going to alert here for a sound clip. David Minton is one of the more authoritative professors of anatomy in the world. In fact, you look up an anatomy dictionary, the textbook for doctors, and you'll find a number of articles by him. He is a creationist, obviously, but he's a very authoritative scientist. Let's hear what he has to say.
So you get the picture? The creatures like Lucy have the ape orientation of the iliac blades. Now, what are the evolutionists going to do about that? You're not going to believe this. Nova, have you heard Nova? There was a PBS Nova series in which Dr. Owen Lovejoy, a very distinguished, famous paleoanthropologist, was involved. And he's looking at Lucy's skeleton here, and he's lamenting the fact that the hips are all wrong. They're supposed to be human-like hips, so you can walk the way the Latoli footprints showed she walked, but they don't look like human hips, they look like ape hips. What to do about this? Watch it, you'll get a big kick out of this.
The ape that stood up, it was a revolutionary idea. We needed Owen Lovejoy's expertise again, because the evidence wasn't quite adding up. The knee looked human, but the shape of her hip didn't. Superficially, her hip resembled a chimpanzee's, which meant that Lucy couldn't possibly have walked like a modern human. But Lovejoy noticed something odd about the way the bones had been fossilized.
When I put the two parts of the pelvis together that we had, this part of the pelvis has pressed so hard and so completely into this one that it caused it to be broken into a series of individual pieces which were then fused together in later fossils.
So you see they were broken and they don't fit together properly. They did speculate in the program as to exactly who was responsible for breaking the hip, and current scientific evidence suggests perhaps a deer stepped on it. Here you can see a deer foot stepping on the bone. Isn't that a bummer? Let's see where it goes from here.
This has caused the two bones, in fact, to fit together so well that they're in an anatomically impossible position.
The perfect fit was an illusion that made Lucy's hip bones seem to flare out like a chimp's. But all was not lost.
This is a power saw, friends. You may want to put your goggles on.
Lovejoy decided he could restore the pelvis to its natural shape. He didn't want to tamper with the original, so he made a copy in plaster.
Notice he's removing whole parts, not just cutting.
He cut the damaged pieces out and put them back together the way they were before Lucy died. It was a tricky job, but after taking the kink out of the pelvis, it all fit together perfectly, like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle.
Look how perfect! You can read a newspaper through the hole.
As a result, the angle of the hip looks nothing like a chimp's, but a lot like ours.
Yeah, now, this is what we call science. You can teach this in the public schools, but you can't criticize it, because if you do, that would be religious. So,
I think that's rather insightful and doesn't need a whole lot of comment. that's not science that I appreciate. Notice the statement by Zillman, who is commenting about Lucy and the pygmy chimp. They're almost identical in body size and stature and brain size. These commonalities, Zillman argues, indicate that pygmy chimps use their limbs in much the same way Lucy did. And she may have stood up like a chimpanzee, not effectively as, and by the way, we have found 12 more specimens since that first one was found, and they all needed hip surgery. But what's the implication of the fact that the ape stood up or almost stood up? Very interesting story was reported several years ago from Israel, where a group of macaque monkeys got the flu, and several of them died. This one survived. Workers at the zoo say that's when she started walking upright exclusively. Zoo veterinarian says she's not sure why she's altered her behavior. The illness could have caused brain damage, and maybe that's why we walk upright. I don't know. But does that prove anything one way or the other? We look at animals that almost walk upright. Some of them do a very good job upright. The dancing chickens here, and anteaters walk upright. You've got the prairie dogs that do a good job of standing upright, and some lizards that stand upright. Some of them walk so well they can run on the water. And we've got some of them that have learned to sell insurance. But I don't think that means a whole lot as far as the evidence for evolution is concerned. Now, we have the handouts that we have, and the one that was missing the other evening we've replaced. In it, you find the documentation for all of the comments that we have here that show from the authorities that she walked like an ape, and we've shown that from the clip. Brain the size of an ape, teeth like the Galata baboon. Not all apes have the same kind of teeth, but there are some that are just like this. A face like an ape, arms long like an ape relative to the body, hands like an ape wrapped around the branches, and legs, feet like an ape, and toes like an ape. So what do you think that was? Must have been a duck, huh? I think we're looking at an ape here for that first rung of the ladder. We go from there to Homo erectus, and this is sort of a hodgepodge of several things. Historically, this is where the story begins, actually with Piltdown, which most people recognize turned out to be a fraud. It wasn't for about 40 years. It was in all the textbooks as proof. And in the monkey trial there in Tennessee, this was primary evidence, along with some other things that have had to be tossed out. But it was obviously fraudulently put together, filed down, stained, partial cranium, partial ape jaw. And here we see a very famous painting where the best anthropologists of the day at Cambridge were examining these parts and couldn't see the very crude fraud. Dawson and Woodward and Keith, and interestingly, Louis Leakey was a student there at the time at Cambridge, and they would not allow him to see it. Only the leading experts were allowed to see it. But consider the comment that's made by Roger Lewin, again, editor of Research News, regarding what you see in this picture as they're examining this fraud. He says, how is it that the trained men, the greatest experts of their day, could look at a set of modern human bones, the cranial fragments, and see a clear simian signature? It wasn't there, but they saw it. And see in an ape's jaw the unmistakable signs of humanity. The answers, he says, inevitably have to do with the scientists' expectations and the effects on their interpretation of the data. They saw what they wanted to see. as one fellow put it, if I hadn't have believed it, I wouldn't have seen it. And that's what we see illustrated there. It wasn't the only embarrassing moment in the early stages trying to find this example of Homo erectus. This is a picture of the page with the article written by Harry Fairfield Osborn, who's curator and president of the American Museum of Natural History, entitled Hesperopithecus, the first anthropoid primate found in North America. And this was news found around the world. He was called Hesperopithecus Harold Cooki. Harold Cook is the geologist who actually found it. But this is what they found, the tooth here. Now, that's not two teeth. That's two views of one tooth, the top and the side. And from that, they got this picture, which appeared on the front page of the London Illustrated News. We've edited it somewhat. The camels are all modern and the donkeys are modern, but the ape man is a mess. Hesperopithecus Harold Cooki. Well, they continued to excavate in the area and they found more than the tooth. They found other skeletons that had the same kind of teeth, and it wasn't a human at all. It was an extinct pig. If he'd been in Arkansas, we could have straightened him out on that. Somebody said they should have called him Hesperopigdunfulum Cuckoo. But that's the president and curator of the American Museum of Natural History, and that's. I've been making these presentations for some time, and I got to a point where I just skipped over that. That's embarrassing, but they have recognized that these are frauds. But I decided to go back over that because they're doing the same thing today. Now, make me prove that. We'll do that as we get to the end, and we'll see exactly the same kind of fraudulent material. Homo erectus is left now with the Java man, and the Java man has had a complete makeover. He's now us. They had to change the dates from several of the things that were found with him. No longer 500,000 years old, but 27,000, which is nothing. That's us. And so now anthropologist Milford Woolproff, University of Michigan, has said this is Homo sapien. We do have the 1470 skull that we referred to earlier, the National Kenyan Museum East Rudolph skull. And according to the one that found it, Richard Leakey, this is as modern as it gets, the high vaulted skull, large brain. And he says either we toss this skull out or we toss out our theories of early man, because this is supposed to be 2.5 million years old, and that's as old as the Australopithecus. And they were going to put it, well, no, it doesn't look like that, so we'll put him up with Homo erectus, but he still is modern, tentatively identified as belonging to our own genus, according to the one that found it. Falk has done some more work in that area with very definitive, what they call endocasts. That's the inside of the brain. The skull leaves imprints inside that tells you a lot about the brain. He said it's like that of a modern human. Outside and inside, it looks human. And so he says this skull's surprisingly large brain case just doesn't fit the picture. It ruins the notion that all the early fossils can be arranged in an orderly sequence of evolutionary change, which the textbooks don't know. But he is also the one that found the Turkana boy that we talked about earlier, 5'6" at 9 years old, compared to today's average of 4.6, which they lump together now with Homo erectus. And then we have the footprints, which they have now put with Homo erectus instead of with Australopithecus, because with further research, here reported in Science Daily, to our surprise, Laetoli footprints fall completely within the range of normal human footprints. So here we've got that which is supposed to lead the man right at the bottom rung of the ladder, Australopithecus, and right with them they've got modern human footprints, which they call Homo erectus, but they're normal human footprints. Well, and then the only other representative of this category of Homo erectus is Canopy man, and it's way down below Australopithecus as far as their time scale is concerned at 4.4 million. Australopithecus begins at about 3. William Howells of Harvard, who was head of the anthropology department when he wrote this, said with a date of about 4.4 million, Canopy could not be distinguished from Homo sapien, morphologically, the shape, the bones, or by multivariate analysis. That's when you take the two bones you're comparing the modern and the fossil. You make about 1,000 different measurements of each one. You put it all in the computer, and the computer tells you exactly how similar it is. Multivariate analysis. Could not be distinguished from Homo sapien, or by much more searching analysis by others. And so that's modern. So we look at Homo erectus, you got Java man, which has now been upgraded to Homo sapien just a few thousand years ago. Turkana boy, bigger than we are today, the 1470 skull with the endocast and the cranium like ours, and then the Laetoli footprints, which are normal human footprints, and Canopy, which is indistinguishable from modern. Wow, that's a real threat to our faith. These are men that they're trying to shoehorn in, but I don't think that's a problem at all. You've got apes and you've got men. Well, the next rung of the ladder is the Neanderthal. Anybody ever heard of them? And they're scary-looking critters. The Neander Valley near Dusseldorf, Germany, is where there was a cave found, and here was some people that lived in a cave. We got cave people today, as they did then. But Marcellin Buell was called on to restore this and to tell us what this thing looked like, and this is what he came up with. That's pretty scary. You find him in an alley, it's time to run the other way. Notice what Ian Tattersall said. He's head of the Department of Anthropology of the American Museum of Natural History. Now, that's a pretty heavy hitter, upgrading this in his book, The Fossil Trail, the recognition, finally, that the stoop-shouldered, bent-kneed stereotype of these humans created by Marcellin Buell was totally false. For one thing, he said he got the ankle bones on backwards, and by all laws of physics, he should have fallen on his face. It really made him stand funny. That's not the picture. Furthermore, Neanderthal had a considerably larger brain than ours. The European and Europeans today get to be modern because there are more of them with anthropology degrees, I guess, but that's considered the standard, and Neanderthal was larger. Richard Leakey said the brain was slightly larger than that of modern humans. He goes on to say a body, though somewhat stocky, was essentially like modern man's, and this is his illustration. Matt Cartmill, another heavy hitter, president of the American Association of Physical Anthropology, says, I tend to think that Neanderthal had fully human language. After all, they had larger brains, as we pointed out. They point out some really, I'm not an art expert, but I don't think I could do that. That's pretty artistic, especially if you're doing it on cave walls instead of campus. They were musical, and we've got another sound clip here. Would you like to hear what a Neanderthal flute sounds like? Same do-re-mi scale that we have. Now, I wouldn't be able to play anything on it, but what could you, if it's got to be, the little holes have to be placed just right in order to sound like music. Here's an anthropologist playing that music. the Neanderthal flute that works just fine. These were not brutes running around talking to each other saying, ugh. They did bury their dead with religious ceremony, here according to Richard Leakey and Roger Lewin. The picture, of course, prejudices the issue somewhat. Their graves were intentional interments, ritualistic elements, fonta placed in the hands, that is, flowers in their hands, along with red ochre-colored pigment possibly used as symbolic ritual. Numbers of things, bits and pieces, are coming to light. Bar Yosef, whom I've met there in Israel, was working at Mount Carmel, and there he found in the cave residents at various levels, but the modern was lower and the Neanderthal higher. The results, he says, have shaken evolutionary scenarios. But one of the things that was interesting about these specimens, several of them found there at Mount Carmel, there was no postcranial material. In other words, they only had skulls. I think I know where about 450 lost their heads there at Mount Carmel. You know the story of what went on. There's some speculation, but you got a bunch of skulls there, and maybe those prophets of Baal were Neanderthal. You can just erase that. That's not scientific. We do find from the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that they were able to extract protein from a Neanderthal skull that was found in Iraq, and that the sequence was the same as modern humans. Now, sequencing protein from a skull first says it's not that long ago, and second says it's not that different. In fact, DNA has been found. This was reported back in '97. Human DNA from the Neanderthal. The DNA overlapped. The amount of diversity between Neanderthals and living humans is not exceptional. You didn't know that, not in your textbook. Science reports the gene flow with Neanderthals exists in all modern humans. This was published 2020. We won't get personal, but we can look around and yeah, maybe. No. It's a person. We see a variety of people in the world today, and there always has been. Professor Tricus from Washington University is probably the leading expert in the world on Neanderthal fossils. In fact, this is the website from the University of Washington. They're bragging on him, and I think they're right. Professor Tricus is considered by many to be the world's most influential scholar of Neanderthal biology and evolution. He was quoted in Live Science saying he has not seen evidence of any kind of difference, whether biological or social, between humans and Neanderthals. Now, that's the leading authority. In fact, here in New Scientist, he was quoted as saying, enough of the cheap jibes, Neanderthal may have been just as clever as modern humans. And that is the trend that you see being reported in the journals today. Here's even a little bit more updated, 2018, Neanderthal, and the representation here is their representation of the wrong way to do it. Unwarranted image as brutish and uncaring. And this was also there on the same article. The study by University of New York reveals Neanderthal health care was as compassionate and knowledgeable in response to injury and illness, challenging our notion that they were brutish. It also points out that it's obvious they were seafarers. We didn't know that about them, did we? They were good people. And you look around and you do see some similarities. Somebody sent me this picture of a Russian politician. And after what's going on here recently, I wasn't quite sure that might be a good idea. I'll just let you look at it. That upper profile of this politician looks pretty Neanderthalish. And it calls for a joke, but I'm not going to go there. We see this upgrading of our view of Neanderthals, also illustrated here in ABC News. The image of Neanderthal may be in need of a makeover, they say. Scientists say that at least some of these extinct hominids could have had fair skin and red hair. When they do the DNA, sometimes you can tell that, yeah, there's red hair here and fair skin. Have you seen red-headed, fair-skinned Neanderthals represented? I guarantee you hadn't seen that. But what did they look like? Well, you can, just depends on who does the restoration. Julianne Moore might not appreciate that, but the skull fits. If the skull fits where it is, I don't. National Geographic did their representation of the fair-skinned, red-haired female, and it didn't look as nice as Julianne Moore. She was very much in need of some cosmetics, which we have found that Neanderthal did use. Here from BBC World News, Makeup discovered this is the first secure evidence for their use of cosmetics. To me, it's the smoking gun that kills the argument once and for all. Bury this view of Neanderthals as half-wits. Also, fairly recently, we found they use painkillers and antibiotics. That's the headline in Science. DNA analysis reveals natural painkiller, salicylic acid, an active ingredient in aspirin. Antibiotic-producing penicillium used to self-medicate a dental abscess. So, we summarize what we find with Neanderthal. According to Leakey, they were unquestionably Homo sapien. Ridiculous reconstruction means they should have fallen on their face, but the better reconstruction looks totally different. That was wrong. The modern Mount Carmel was found lower than Neanderthal. You find human language indicated from several things. Larger brain. They have the same protein that we have. They have overlapping DNA. Buried their dead with religious ceremony. They were musical, fair-skinned and red hair with cosmetics and medication. That's not very threatening, is it? They also were seafaring, yeah. I think they were good people. So, what we've got is apes and men leading up to modern, and that's the picture that's presented in the textbooks, but that's not very threatening, is it? Very interesting summary statement was made by Bernard Wood, who is one of the leading authorities. He wrote the book Human Evolution. It's taught in a lot of universities. Professor of Human Origins, George Washington University. He said, with all the fossil evidence from the past 50 years, okay, all of that evidence, we ought to now confirm it, right? With all of the evidence for the past 50 years, a convincing hypothesis for the origin of Homo remains elusive. I think that's a pretty good statement. That's an accurate statement. But that's not what's being presented. Now, we spent a good bit of time in Dallas, and I'm familiar with the Perot Museum, and had a little bit to do with the beginnings of it a while back. And it's a pretty amazing place. Supposed to be the world's largest dinosaur exhibit. I don't think that's true, but that's one of their claims. Notice an exhibit that they've advertised. Actually, this is a page from Science News, which is reporting about what the Perot Museum is doing in Dallas. Meet your extended family as a new human evolution exhibit. They've got the latest and greatest proof of human evolution, and this is one of the brochures from that display that started late 2019 and on into 2020. Here we have ancient human ancestors. Maybe you can read that. Reflect on what it means to be human. This is what they're presenting in their display. And then the backside, one of the greatest fossil discoveries of the past century that you're going to get to see. Two powerful proofs of evolution. Here's the title, Origins, Fossils from the Cradle of Humankind, an exhibition of fossils recently discovered, ancient human relatives. And one of them is Homo, the lady. The other one is Australopithecus sediba. Now, just looking at that and them saying these are ancient human relatives, here is the latest, the mostest, greatest of everything you can come up with. When you see something like that, I respond by saying, well, let's see what you got here. Let's look at the original description in the journals and see what we really have. I know better than to trust the headlines. Well, it was written up in Science 2013, and they pointed out there were 15 individuals, 1,500 bones. Okay, we've got a lot of data here. We ought to be able to learn a lot with 1,500 bones, 15 individuals. And then the first thing they tell us, they were unable to date its age. Now, wait a minute, you got 1,500 bones here. 15 with the more sophisticated dating processes today, you don't need but just a fraction of a gram in order to do the dating. And they've got 1,500 bones and they can't get a date. What that tells me is they got dates. They got lots of dates, and none of them fit what they wanted them to be. And so we can't date it. There's no, I can't imagine another explanation. He goes on to say, had a sloped, this is from Science, sloped lower face, very robust mandible that bears little resemblance to humans. Now, I didn't write that. This is in Science, the original description. Small cranium, phalanges, those are the fingers on the hand, are even more curved than in Australopithecus afarensis, that's Lucy. So they wrap around branches, suggesting an ape-like creature. Okay, they can't tell its age. It might be 1,000 years. Curved fingers, small cranium, little resemblance to humans, an ape-like creature. Wow, that's a great discovery, isn't it? That really gets the headlines, and they're charging $20 a pop, and hundreds of thousands of people going through there saying, here's your ancestor. Now, the frauds haven't stopped. We look at the other representative, Australopithecus sediba, discovered in 2011. Here's the description from Science. The foot looked like that of an extinct ape, a tiny brain, a chimp-sized body. Isn't that a surprise? Similar to the hands of apes that climb trees, came with long, primitive arms, that is like an ape, suggested it hoisted itself up into the trees. Heels were primitive. The heels primitive in that it didn't have the mechanism that allowed them to rock back and forth with an arch like people walk with, but like an ape. Skeletons and their analysis convince few no one's redrawing the family trees. Well, that was in 2011. Fast forward now when Barreau needs a display, and now they're redrawing the family tree, and here is the star. Interestingly, there was an extra report that was published in Science the year that they began this display, early in the year, 2019. That display in the museum started in November of 19, but the headlines referring to one of their stars of the show, temporal evidence show that Australopithecus sediba is unlikely to be the ancestor of Homo. That's what science says. And here they're telling everybody this is their ancestor. Come give me your $20, and thousands of people flock in. This is their headline. Together, these two remarkable discoveries provide further evidence for the complex, nuanced processes of human evolution. And the journals are saying, no way, it's not possible. When you get the facts, they're just as deceitful as Harry Fairfield Osborn and his pig tooth. Not that he was deceitful, he just didn't know any better. I don't know whether these folk know better or not. I think we can summarize the picture in general this way. As we look at the proposed ancestors and see what the evidence is, we go to the zoo, you go to the ape barn or to the area where they have all the different kinds of apes, and you see a significant variety. They're all kinds, and I think our Creator loves variety, and that's demonstrated. You don't see one leading to the other. You just see the varieties. It shouldn't surprise us that we see similar variety, not quite as much, but variety among humans that exist on the world today, showing our Creator loves variety. When we measure the intellect, the abilities, the nobility of such individuals, we cannot find a difference, and that can be documented, especially with the Human Genome Project, 99.9.8. It's a vanishing little bit of fraction that they're all the same in terms of percentage of DNA. Now, some of them, from our perspective, may look a little strange, but it depends on what we get used to. You put them in a tie and a white shirt, and most of them can look pretty good. And that's the evidence. We got apes and we got men. There's variety, but that's the evidence. Now, they do their best to come up with something else, but what you got is either apes or humans, or as Dwayne Gish used to say, you take a little incus opus and a little hocus pocus and you come up with Pithecus spoofus. And that's all you got in the middle. That's why I believe we can say confidently, when you look squarely at the evidence, that the fossil record of men favors creation, that we can see the evidence is ours. And we don't have to be afraid of that any more than we were when we looked at the fossil record. As we indicated last evening, it's the same song, just the second verse. It's a picture that supports creation. I think that's the nature of all the evidence. We just go with the facts, and it's just really fun to just not have to shoehorn and twist and play like Cinderella's ugly stepsister and make that foot fit, and it doesn't. You just go with the evidence, and it's much easier and much more confident and faith building. If you're here and haven't confessed your faith in God's Son, Jesus Christ, we want to encourage you to do that. The book that describes the beginning not that long ago and the end coming not that far in the future says you need to be ready, and you're lost without the power of the blood. You can be baptized into the death of Christ, raised to walk in a new life. And if we can help you in any way, we encourage you to do that while we stand and sing.